He came to say goodbye to his friend, but the guards wouldn't even let him in. They thought he was just an old man in a foreign uniform. After a few minutes, the ceremony stopped. One man stepped out of line and changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and post in the comments where you're watching from. The morning light filtered weakly through the lace curtains of Harold Johnson's small row house on the edge of West Baltimore, casting soft patterns across the time-worn floorboards. The house, like its owner, stood in quiet defiance of time, weathered but dignified. Paint peeled along the windowsills, the screen door groaned with every breath of wind, and the porch steps sagged ever so slightly in the middle. But everything inside was in perfect order. The floors were swept, the air smelled faintly of pine cleaner and black coffee, and the small framed photos that lined the mantel were free of dust, each one carefully aligned and cherished. Harold moved slowly through his routine, not because he was infirm, but because every motion was deliberate, disciplined. He rose before the sun, as he always had, with the steady rhythm of a man who never quite shook the structure the military had built into his bones. He shaved with cold water, like he'd done in the jungle. He pressed his pants with the same care he once reserved for polishing boots before inspection. This morning, however, there was a difference, a ceremony in each gesture, a weight behind every movement. The faded olive-green uniform hung from a wooden hanger near the bedroom door, its creases sharp, its brass buttons dulled by age, but still carefully buffed to catch the light. The cloth was thinner now, the color not quite what it had been, but it had survived time, just as he had. He ran his fingers over the shoulder patch, two crimson wings flanking a black owl. Ghost Recon, Laos, 1971. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, they had done what others couldn't or wouldn't. Harold hadn't worn the uniform in over 30 years. He set it down carefully across the bed and retrieved a small mahogany box from his dresser drawer. Inside, wrapped in a clean white cloth, were the ashes of Sergeant Darnell Eldridge, his best friend, his foxhole brother, the one man who could still make him laugh in the darkest moments. They'd promised each other, back in the mud and the madness, that if one of them didn't make it home, the other would carry him there. But there had been no homecoming for the dead back then, not the kind anyone noticed. So, Harold waited. Until now. His wrinkled hands held the box with quiet reverence. He sat with it at the edge of his bed, watching the morning grow lighter outside. Today was the Memorial Day parade in Washington, D.C. They were adding Darnell's name to the wall, not because the government remembered, but because a local historian, also black and also persistent, had dug through the files and found the overlooked report, 49 years late. Harold hadn't been invited, but he was going. He made a pot of coffee, bitter and strong, and sipped it in silence at the kitchen table, glancing occasionally at the clock. The house was filled with the hush of early hours, broken only by the creaks of its old bones and the distant rumble of traffic. The framed medals on the wall had long since lost their shine. So had the citation of bravery from a battle no one liked to remember. But the picture above them, the one where he and Darnell stood shoulder to shoulder in soaked fatigues, smiling like fools despite the blood and rain, that one still glowed with life. At exactly 6:05, Harold stood, dressed in full uniform, his silver-rimmed glasses glinting. He adjusted his cap, picked up the urn, and locked the door behind him. Outside, the air was cool with the breath of early summer, the city just beginning to stir. His neighbors didn't notice him pass. They rarely did. Old Harold, the quiet man with the limp and the tired eyes. No one asked where he went each Memorial Day. Most assumed he was headed to church or the bus depot. He walked 3 blocks to the nearest bus stop, his cane tapping gently against the cracked pavement. No one offered him a seat on the ride downtown. Teenagers with earbuds glanced up and looked away. A man in a suit sighed audibly when Harold accidentally brushed his shoulder. The urn rested on his lap, wrapped in a faded blue towel. He held it with both hands. At the Central Station, he boarded a long-distance coach bound for Washington. It was a 5-hour ride with a layover in Richmond. The driver barely looked at his ticket. The seats were stiff and narrow. The air conditioning blasted inconsistently. But Harold didn't complain. He simply stared out the window, watching the familiar blur of roadside towns and half-forgotten landscapes unfold like pages in a book he hadn't opened in years. Memories came in waves, uninvited but not unwelcome. The drop zone in Quang Tri, the searing heat of the jungle, the night Darnell took shrapnel and still carried him half a mile to safety. The nights they laughed under tarps in monsoon rains, playing cards with bent cigarettes and betting food they didn't have. The dawns when they sat in silence after losing one more friend whose name never made the list. Somewhere outside Alexandria, he drifted into a light doze, the rhythm of the road rocking him into memories. When he awoke, the box was still cradled in his arms. He sat up straighter, glanced around. No one had touched him. Most hadn't even looked. They arrived in D.C. just after 11. The streets were already buzzing with preparations. Barricades, police cruisers, camera crews setting up near the Capitol Mall. Flags snapped in the wind. Music drifted faintly from loudspeakers being tested. Harold stepped off the bus slowly, waiting for the crowd to thin before he began his walk. He didn't need directions. His feet knew the way. Decades ago, he had marched this path in full salute. That time, no one watched. Today, there were cameras, but not for him. By the time he reached the entry point near the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, his back ached and his knee throbbed. But he stood straight, holding the urn, his cane braced in his left hand. A young officer, white and barely 25, stood by the metal barricade scanning passes. His uniform was perfect, his haircut sharp, his expression coldly efficient. Harold stepped forward and offered his identification. The officer frowned, turning the old card over in his hands. "This is expired," he said. "It's real," Harold replied evenly. "Sir, this event is for invited guests and approved veterans only." Harold said nothing. He knew this dance. The boy didn't recognize the unit insignia, didn't know the history, didn't see anything beyond the faded cloth and brown skin. "You'll need to wait over there," the officer added, motioning to a distant crowd of spectators. "This area is restricted." Harold looked past him at the long, black wall stretching out across the grass. He could almost see Darnell's name. Almost. "I'm here for a friend," he said. "You'll need clearance. I'm sorry." He stepped back without another word. The crowd behind him surged forward, flashing crisp invitations, wearing pressed uniforms and fresh medals. Some looked at him with brief curiosity. Most looked through him. He found a bench beneath a tree just beyond the barricade and sat. The urn rested once more on his lap. The wind stirred the grass. Flags rippled in steady rhythm. In the distance, a drum line began to warm up, slow and steady. Harold closed his eyes. The rhythm matched the old cadence in his bones. No one saw him arrive. No one asked his name. But he had come, just as he promised. And even if the country still hadn't remembered him, he remembered it all. The bench beneath Harold creaked faintly as he shifted, stretching his back with a soft wince. The memorial lawn spread before him like a vast field of ceremony, dressed in red, white, and blue. Flags flanked the sidewalks, ribbons twisted from every pole. Spectators, families, veterans, officials, and tourists milled about in organized chaos as the final minutes before the parade dwindled away. Harold sat still, the way a soldier sits when the mission demands patience. The urn rested in his lap, a small solemn weight against his thighs. Around him, people moved without noticing him. He could feel it. Not hostility, but something subtler, colder. Invisibility, the kind he had carried most of his life. He was there for one thing, and one thing only: the wall. The black granite monolith stretched like a scar against the earth, reflecting sunlight and shadows in equal measure. From where he sat, Harold could just see the edge of it, where new names had recently been added. One of them was Darnell's. It had taken decades, but it was there now, etched in stone as it should have been so long ago. All Harold wanted was to deliver his friend home. But the barrier still stood between them. And so did the boy in uniform. He rose slowly and approached the security checkpoint again. A different young officer, perhaps 2 years older than the first, had taken post. His uniform was darker, more decorated, likely a second lieutenant. Harold cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me," he said, voice low. The officer turned. He glanced at the old man before him, his faded jacket, his cane, the polished yet dull insignia, the urn in his hand. There was a brief flicker of confusion, then detachment, a trained kind of dismissal. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm trying to reach the wall, section 39, line 52. "You'll need an invitation badge to pass through. Do you have one?" Harold pulled the laminated card from his inner coat pocket. It was cracked at the edges, the color faded from years of exposure, but it was genuine. Department of Veterans Affairs, dated 1995, with his full name and division. The officer took it, scanned it, frowned. "This isn't current. It doesn't have the 2020 stamp. And this unit, I've never heard of this designation." Harold's jaw remained still. He didn't expect them to know Ghost Recon. That wasn't their fault. Their training manuals didn't list unacknowledged operations. There were no unit patches for the missions conducted in countries the government denied even entering. "It's valid," Harold said quietly. "I'm sure it was, at some point," the officer replied, "but I can't let you through without current clearance. I'm not here to join the ceremony. I'm here to deliver my friend." "Sir, I understand, but rules are rules. You can observe from the general audience area." Others began to queue behind him. Voices grumbled. A woman in pearls and a wide-brimmed hat murmured, "Why's he holding up the line?" A man in dark glasses shook his head. Harold could feel the judgment sliding over him like oil. He'd felt it in '68 in a diner in Georgia, in '74, when he returned to a country that thanked him with closed doors and job applications that mysteriously disappeared. He had lived a life where worth was measured by how little he demanded in return. And still, he didn't argue. He nodded once and stepped aside again. He returned to his bench beneath the tree, the same tree that seemed to offer no shade from the heat building behind his temples. He set the urn gently on his lap once more, straightened the brim of his cap, and sat still. Around him, the celebration continued. Marching bands warmed up, brass horns gleaming in the sun. Photographers lined the barriers, angling for shots of senators and decorated officers arriving with their entourages. Harold watched it all with the same expression he wore in the jungle: calm, distant, alert. His fingers curled around the handle of his cane, the knuckles tight and pale. The weight in his lap felt heavier now, not just because of Darnell, but because of what this place was refusing to remember. A group of children passed nearby, chattering about the planes overhead, waving little plastic flags. One boy pointed toward the security line and asked, "Why can't that old guy go in?" His father tugged his hand. "Probably in the wrong place," he said dismissively. Harold exhaled softly, not angry, just tired. From his bench, he could see the long rows of seats filling with people. Politicians with crisp suits and pinned ribbons, high-ranking military officials with chests full of medals, every gesture practiced for the cameras. He watched a Marine colonel rehearse a handshake with a senator, smiling with eyes that didn't move. Everything choreographed. Darnell hated this kind of thing. "I don't need nobody to clap for me," he used to say. "I just want them to stop pretending I never existed." Harold looked at the urn. "I'm trying, brother," he murmured. A golf cart rolled past carrying a 4-star general toward the stage. Several aides jogged alongside it. Behind them, a procession of retired officers walked in careful rhythm, their faces solemn, their steps steady. One of them, a tall man with a silver mustache, glanced briefly in Harold's direction, then looked away. Just another face in the crowd. Just another ghost on the lawn. Nearby, a woman with a press badge pointed her camera toward a group of children in uniform, all saluting in unison. She turned, spotted Harold, hesitated, and then moved away. There were no headlines in Forgotten Men. The microphone crackled. A voice announced the beginning of the ceremony. The national anthem began to play. Everyone stood. Harold rose too, slowly, supporting himself on the cane. He held the urn against his chest, the movement gentle, almost cradling. The anthem echoed across the lawn, triumphant and proud. It spoke of rockets' red glare, of freedom and bravery. It was meant to bind them all together. But, standing outside the barricade, Harold couldn't help but feel it was singing to someone else. He lowered himself back onto the bench as the speeches began. The Secretary of Defense spoke of sacrifice. The mayor of D.C. read names. The president, speaking from a pre-recorded video, thanked the heroes who had built the nation's legacy. Harold listened to every word, and yet not once did he hear a mention of his unit. Not once did the jungle come up. Not once did they say his name or the name of the man whose ashes rested in his lap. When the music played again, he bowed his head, not to the ceremony, but to the memory. To the men who had died unnamed in places that were never on the map, to the lives buried in sealed files and lost records. He sat through the whole thing. An hour, then 2. The sun rose higher. The breeze grew heavier. But Harold didn't move, not even when a pair of officers passed by him, laughing under their breath. "Probably one of those impersonators," one said. "You see those guys on YouTube, always trying to crash the parades? Could be. You know how it is." Harold didn't flinch. Eventually, the ceremony began to wind down. The crowd started to disperse. The photographers packed up their gear. VIPs were ushered to private receptions. Laughter and handshakes filled the air like perfume. Harold remained still. He had not shouted. He had not demanded. He had not told anyone who he was. He had shown up, and that was more than most ever did. When the last chords of the military band faded into silence, he looked once more toward the wall, still distant, still out of reach, but he wasn't done. He never was. The sun had begun its climb towards the noonday zenith, casting shorter shadows across the memorial grounds. The last of the official ceremony's guests had thinned into distant clusters, some lingering at the refreshment stations under white tents, others retreating toward shuttle buses or catching up in slow-moving lines of departing vehicles. Despite the dispersal, Harold Johnson remained anchored beneath the same maple tree, as immovable as one of the stone monuments dotting the field. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't left his seat. His only movements were the slow shift of posture as the aches in his joints demanded mercy. The urn still rested across his lap, guarded by both hands. The slight tarnish in its bronze shimmered softly with the sun's reflection, a quiet testament to years gone and debts unpaid. A single bee buzzed near his elbow and moved on. Harold didn't stir. From time to time he looked toward the wall in the distance and the empty barrier between them. He had given up on being noticed. Long ago, he learned that no man needed a spotlight to live a worthy life, and certainly not to honor another's. The uniform wrapped his frame like a second skin, creased, sun-washed, but strong. On his left shoulder, stitched with precision and pride, sat a small red and black insignia, a pair of stylized owl wings over a downward-pointing dagger. It meant nothing to most, certainly not to today's young recruits, but to those who knew, it was a symbol of ghosts, men who moved where others wouldn't, who came home without fanfare, who buried their stories deeper than medals could reach. One such recruit, however, did notice. Private First Class Raymond Carter was 22, fresh out of Fort Benning, and wide-eyed with the quiet awe of his first national ceremony. He had been assigned to post-parade cleanup detail, collecting cones, retrieving folding chairs, rerouting lost civilians who tried to wander behind restricted zones. When he passed by the tree line and spotted the man in the old uniform, he paused. There was something in the posture, the way the man sat, not as a tourist nor as a protester, but as someone exactly where he belonged, despite every signal to the contrary. What caught his eye next was the patch. Carter had spent the last 6 months deep in military history forums. He was the kind of kid who didn't just train to be a soldier. He wanted to understand the lineage of what he'd joined. And the patch, he'd only seen it once before, in a footnote, a single grainy photo attached to a classified review of the Laos covert incursions. The emblem had never been publicly authorized. No official merch, no printed mention in government catalogs. It wasn't even supposed to exist. And yet, there it was, sewn onto the shoulder of an old black man who sat as still as stone under a tree with an urn in his lap. Carter's heart kicked a little faster. He turned his head, looked for his sergeant. Nowhere in sight. He stepped a little closer, pretending to inspect the folding barricade nearby, though his eyes remained fixed on the man. Finally, unable to resist, he drew his phone from his pocket, angled the camera discreetly, and took a picture of the patch. Then he backed away, his mind already racing. Back near the water stations, Carter dropped into a squat behind one of the catering tables and pulled up the military historians forum he'd been scrolling during long overnight watches. He uploaded the photo with a single caption. "Is this real? Ghost Recon, Laos Patch, 1971? He didn't expect a reply for hours, but within 3 minutes, notifications exploded across his screen. User 343. Where did you see this? That patch is legit. My grandfather mentioned guys wearing it, called them phantoms with teeth. James Rowe, 71. Holy hell. I saw that symbol once. My uncle was an intel during Nixon's last term. Said these guys weren't on paper. If this is real. Vet_Ravenwood. That's not just real. That's the Johnson. I met him once at a shelter in Baltimore. Saved lives in Khe Sanh and Laos, but the VA never listed his unit because it was Black Ops. His best friend died during an extraction in '71. Carried him back through a jungle fire zone. No backup, no evac. Carter's hands trembled as he scrolled, the screen now flooded with links to obscure blog posts, half-erased citations, and one grainy newspaper clipping from 1975. Man denied medal after heroic rescue. Cites racial bias. The man in the photo was younger, but unmistakably the same. Sharp cheekbones, narrowed eyes, a soldier's set to the jaw. Someone else on the forum typed, "If he's at the parade, why isn't he up front?" That question hit Carter like a gut punch. He rose and looked towards the tree line again. By then, the photo had made it to other circles. One of them was a closed chat group of retired military brass, all men who had spent their careers riding the ladders of promotion and politics. One of the members, Logan Bryson, was now Chief of Staff to General Alexander Bryant, the man who had just given the opening salute from the main podium. Bryson tapped his phone, stared at the image. His face paled. He turned, cutting through the white tent where generals, aides, and key organizers now sipped sparkling water and debriefed the morning ceremonies. He spotted General Bryant standing beside the Secretary of the Army. Bryson made a beeline for him. "Sir," he said, interrupting without apology, "we've got a situation." Bryant raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "I need you to look at this." The phone was passed into the general's hands. For several seconds, Bryant said nothing. His expression changed, however, almost imperceptibly. Then he looked up. "Where is he?" "Edge of the field, near the northwest tree line, sitting alone." The general didn't hesitate. He turned to the secretary with a nod, handed over his glass, and stepped past the cluster of suits. "Hold the next segment," he instructed a nearby aide. "Tell the press it's a minor delay. No cameras for the next 10 minutes. "Yes, sir." Bryant moved quickly, his polished boots leaving soft prints in the grass. Every step was precise, clipped with urgency and gravity. A few bystanders noticed him break formation. Whispers followed his path. They wondered where he was going. And then they saw him head straight toward the old man by the tree. Harold hadn't moved. Not when Carter posted the picture, not when the crowd buzzed online, not even now, as one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army approached him without entourage, without a microphone, and without a word. He sensed the presence only when the footsteps slowed. He looked up. The man before him was tall, square-jawed, with stars on his shoulders and history in his eyes. He said nothing at first, only stood at attention. Then General Bryant lifted his hand and saluted. It was not a casual gesture, not symbolic. It was sharp, full, and deliberate, the kind of salute reserved for heroes. Harold blinked, uncertain. "Sergeant Johnson," the general said, voice steady. "It's an honor." The silence around them thickened. Onlookers had stopped walking. A small ring of murmurs expanded through the crowd. Phones rose, but the general turned toward the press detail nearby and lifted his palm. "No cameras," he commanded. They froze. Bryant turned back. His voice dropped lower. "You saved my life once, sir. 49 years ago, you didn't know it. But I was one of the evac boys you pulled from the hillside in Laos when everything went to hell." Harold looked at him with still eyes. "That was a long time ago. Not long enough to forget." The general stepped aside and gestured toward the main procession, still visible in the distance. The stage now empty. The wall still waiting. "You've been outside the fence long enough," Bryant said. "It's time to come home." The words didn't register at first. Harold stared at him, then at the path now opening behind them. 2 honor guards stepping forward to hold back the growing crowd. A colonel approached silently and handed the general a velvet box. "This is for you," Bryant said, from someone who never stopped remembering. Inside was a folded American flag. Beneath it, a polished brass plaque engraved with a single name, Sergeant Darnell Eldridge. Harold's hand trembled as he touched the surface. "Come with me," the general said. Harold rose slowly, gathering the urn against his chest. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But he walked. For the first time in decades, not toward shadows, but toward light. They walked together without fanfare, but the air around them shifted as if the weight of time and silence had suddenly become tangible. General Alexander Bryant moved with the gravity of rank, every step deliberate, but beside him Harold Johnson moved with something older than protocol. He walked like a man bearing memory itself, not for himself, but for another. The urn remained in his arms, cradled close, wrapped in that same blue cloth that had accompanied him from Baltimore. At his side, the general's stride slowed, matching the measured rhythm of Harold's gait, and the hush that followed them grew steadily. Word of their movement reached the heart of the ceremony before they did. From the main stage, an aide hurried toward the inner perimeter, whispering urgently to the master of ceremonies. Murmurs passed like ripples through the rows of chairs. Veterans stood halfway from their seats, unsure if they should respond. Journalists hesitated, camera lenses twitching like uncertain eyes. And then, breaking tradition, the honor guard that had formed the ceremonial line along the main aisle parted in silence, creating a path that had not been rehearsed. They all watched as the general and the old soldier approached. Harold didn't notice the silence at first. His gaze remained fixed on the black granite wall ahead. It gleamed in the midday sun like obsidian, the names upon it etched with a precision that made them shimmer like stars on a cloudless night. Somewhere among them was Darnell. Somewhere, finally, a name that had not existed on any monument, in any official file, or in any textbook for 5 long decades. Now it was there, waiting for the man who had carried it through fire and decades. When they crossed the inner boundary, Harold's steps faltered only briefly. He was not used to being welcomed across rope lines. 2 officers saluted. Another stepped forward with a small earpiece whispering into it, but stopped as Bryant raised a hand. "Let it go," the general said. "This is his moment." The Secretary of the Army, who had been seated near the front row, rose quietly. Several generals followed. Soon, a ripple of motion passed through the ranks. One by one, uniforms straightened, hats were removed, hands were raised to brows in silent salute. Harold didn't see them. His eyes were locked on the wall. The general turned slightly, voice just loud enough for those near the front to hear. "For those wondering," he said, not as a speech, but as truth, "this man is not a guest. He is not an addendum. He is not a mistake in the records." He turned fully now, his voice rising just enough to carry. "This is Sergeant Harold Nathaniel Johnson, Laos, 1971, Ghost Reconnaissance Division." He led a 2-man extraction through enemy lines under direct fire to retrieve a wounded operative and his radio man. There was no backup, no air cover, no medals given, no press. The operation was classified until 10 years ago, but I was there. The crowd was no longer murmuring. I was that wounded operative. He didn't know my name then. I was just one more soldier down in the mud, bleeding and blind. He got us out, both of us. We lived because of him, and until today, no one has thanked him. That ends now. For a long moment there was no reaction, just the wind. Then a single hand clapped, hesitant. Another followed, then more, but it didn't erupt into applause. It rose like a wave of acknowledgement, respectful and subdued, a sound more like prayer than celebration. Harold blinked. His fingers curled more tightly around the urn. "I don't need any of this," he said softly. General Bryant looked at him with something close to grief in his eyes. "I know," he replied. "That's why you deserve it." A woman from the National Archives approached with a box in her hands, polished wood, a brass plaque on the lid. She offered it without ceremony. Bryant opened it and drew forth the Medal of Honor, its ribbon still folded, the medallion glowing faintly beneath the sun. "She was yours all along," the general said, but he did not place it around Harold's neck. He held it up for the crowd to see, then closed the box and handed it to him. Harold accepted it, but did not look at it. Instead, he turned toward the wall and stepped forward. The path opened for him. Men and women in full dress stood at attention, every branch of the military represented. As he passed, some saluted, others simply bowed their heads. A few placed fists over hearts. No one spoke. At the foot of the wall, a small pedestal had been placed. A folded flag lay on it. Beneath it, a single wreath. No one else stood nearby. The crowd had formed a respectful distance, as if understanding that this was sacred territory now. Harold stepped up to the pedestal. For the first time, his knees trembled slightly, not from pain, but from something deeper. He placed the urn gently upon the stand, adjusted the cloth so it would not catch the breeze, and straightened. He looked up at the names. Row 52, Section 39. And there it was. Eldridge, Darnell, T. The letters were small, unadorned, but to Harold they blazed. For a moment he was back there, in the thick, wet heat of the Laotian jungle, the stench of sweat and cordite, the breathless fear of dusk falling too fast. He remembered the scream of gunfire, the voice yelling for help, the blur of trees and blood and smoke. Darnell, half dragged across a riverbed, laughing through his own pain. "You're ugly as hell, man," he'd said, and Harold had laughed too, even while the tracers whistled overhead. Now, 54 years later, he stood alone, facing the echo. "You're home," he said. There was no dramatic music, no trumpet, just wind. He remained standing for another minute, his hand resting gently on the urn, and then he turned. The general was still there. So was the secretary. So were the soldiers, all waiting. Harold looked out at them, unsure what to do. Bryant stepped forward again and cleared his throat. "There's one more thing." From behind the honor guard came a second line of men. They were older. Some walked with canes, others leaned on sons or aides. All wore pieces of the past. Patches, old hats, jackets with faded names. Harold's breath caught as they approached. Ghost company. He hadn't seen some of them in decades. He had thought many were dead. But they were here now. Each one took his place in a line behind the pedestal. When they reached their positions, they stood at full attention. No one had told them to. No one had rehearsed this, and they simply did it. Harold walked the line slowly. Each man saluted as he passed, some with tears, some with fierce pride, not for show, not for press, because they remembered. And because finally, the country had remembered too. The sky had begun to soften to a gentler blue by the time the final note of silence settled over the crowd. The ceremony was not over, not officially, but in a way that few would ever admit aloud. The real memorial had already taken place. What had transpired between the tree line and the wall, between an old man and his nation's conscience, had eclipsed everything else the day had offered. The wall, with its endless lines of carved names, seemed to watch in mute witness as Harold Johnson stepped down from the platform, his head lowered, his hand still tingling from the brief, solemn touch he'd laid atop the urn. He had not wept. He hadn't allowed himself the indulgence, but something inside him had shifted, unlocked perhaps by the sight of Darnell's name at last where it belonged, among the honored dead, inscribed not just in stone, but finally in memory. General Bryant remained by his side, walking not ahead, not behind, but level, shoulder to shoulder, as the honor guard silently parted once more to let them through. Harold's steps were slow but sure, each one pressed into the grass with the dignity of a march, a kind of ceremony unto itself. The velvet box containing the long-overdue Medal of Honor remained tucked under his arm, still unopened. He had no intention of wearing it. Medals had always seemed more for the living to show than the dead to need. But he held on to it all the same, for Darnell, for those who never made it home. Ahead of them, a second gathering was forming, less rigid, less formal, but charged with a different kind of energy. A makeshift reception line of sorts, veterans from every branch and war, some in full uniform, others in old jackets that smelled of attic trunks and rust, faces lined with time, hands that trembled but still saluted with pride. Many had stood earlier. Now they waited again, this time not for a general or a senator or a parade, but for Harold. As he passed through them, they did not reach out, did not ask for stories or pictures. Instead, they stood in silence, lifting fingers to brows in respectful salute or bowing their heads. Each gesture a recognition not only of Harold, but of every soldier who had returned from the field only to be forgotten by the country they fought for. Each movement said the words America had too often failed to say aloud. Thank you. We remember. Welcome home. But Harold's gaze was fixed on a figure standing just ahead. Colonel Frank Mendez, retired, a lean man with a salt and pepper beard and a patch over his right eye, waited just beyond the inner circle. The last time Harold had seen him was in a field hospital tent in Da Nang, half conscious and laughing deliriously through a morphine haze after taking a bullet meant for someone else. They hadn't spoken since. Mendez stepped forward now, no salute, just a quiet nod. You kept your promise, he said. Harold nodded back. He would have done the same for me. Mendez's voice cracked slightly. We didn't forget him, Harold. We just didn't know how to fight hard enough to get his name on that wall. We failed him. No, Harold said. You waited. That's enough. General Bryant turned to Harold then and gently motioned toward the ceremonial limousine that had pulled to a respectful stop near the grass. The door stood open, the polished interior barely visible beyond the tinted glass. At first, Harold hesitated. He had never ridden in anything like that, not once in his life. It felt strange, too clean, too honored. But Bryant's expression was earnest, and more importantly, he wasn't asking. It was simply offered. Harold stepped forward and allowed himself to be ushered in. Inside the vehicle, the air was cool and quiet. The upholstery smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. Harold sat stiffly at first, unsure where to place the box, the urn, his own hands. The flag on his lap felt like a weight heavier than he remembered. Then he breathed, allowed his back to settle into the seat, and looked out through the tinted window as the world shifted past in hushed movement. They drove through the grounds slowly, reverently, past rows of solemn trees and marble headstones that stretched in neat formation like soldiers standing watch. As they approached the far side of the cemetery, Harold could see the modest platform that had been hastily erected for the final committal. A small canopy fluttered in the breeze. A chaplain waited there along with two Marines in full dress. Beyond them, a group of folding chairs had been arranged into rows, all empty now except for a few scattered veterans who had quietly followed the procession. The vehicle stopped. The door opened. Harold stepped out, not with the stiffness of reluctance, but with the calm of readiness. He carried the urn once more, not because it was required, but because it was right. The Marines saluted. The chaplain stepped forward, but did not speak. He simply nodded and stepped aside. Harold approached the pedestal in the center of the canopy and placed the urn down with both hands. The flag followed, laid gently across the table beside it. For a moment, he stood still, shoulders slightly bowed, not in weakness, but in solemnity. Behind him, General Bryant remained standing. No camera crews, no audience. Just the hush of the cemetery, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. Harold reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, weathered envelope. He had written the note the night before. It wasn't poetry, wasn't profound, just a few simple words. He tucked the envelope beneath the urn. Then he stepped back, and the silence held. It lasted for one long, unbroken minute before the first hand rose. From the tree line came movement. Ghost company, what remained of it. Dozens of men in their 70s and 80s, hobbling, limping, leaning on each other for support. They came not in a formation, but as a brotherhood, each one bearing the same look of something carried too long and too quietly. As they gathered near the pedestal, they did not speak. They saluted one by one, and then stood in a line behind Harold. Bryant took the podium. Not for a speech, but for an offering. There are times, he said, when medals are awarded in front of cameras, when generals are remembered for what they say in press releases. And then there are men like Sergeant Johnson, whose bravery never reached the headlines, whose sacrifices never made the history books. He looked at Harold. But we're writing that history now, with every step he took today, with every name he remembered, with every silence he endured without complaint. He turned toward the small group. And for Sergeant Eldridge, we say today what should have been said 50 years ago. You were never forgotten. You were always our brother. And now you're home. Harold's fingers brushed against the edge of the pedestal one final time. I told him I'd bring him back, he said. A pause, the kind that speaks louder than any eulogy. And now, he added softly, he's exactly where he belongs. The chaplain began the committal rite, but Harold didn't stay for the final prayer. He stepped away, walking slowly toward the line of trees that bordered the cemetery's eastern edge. The others did not follow. Not yet. At the foot of an old sycamore, he stopped and sat on a stone bench facing the field. From there, he could still see the urn, the folded flag, the men saluting in silent tribute. But he no longer needed to be the center of it. That part was done. His hand moved slowly into his coat, retrieving a small lighter and a stick of incense. He struck the flame, lit the tip, and held the smoldering end upright until the smoke curled upward in lazy tendrils. He planted the incense stick into the dirt beside the bench. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't have to. You always did hate flowers, he murmured, watching the smoke rise. Then, after a long breath, rest easy, kid. He closed his eyes. Behind him, the silence held, and it was enough. The smoke from the incense lingered in the warm afternoon air, curling upward like a final prayer as Harold remained seated on the bench beneath the sycamore tree. The bench was old, its concrete edges worn smooth by time and weather, but it held him with quiet grace. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his back straight despite the long hours and the emotional weight that had pressed on his shoulders since morning. Around him, the cemetery had grown quieter. The official guests were gone. The sound of boots on grass had dwindled. The buzz of ceremony had yielded to the soft breath of wind among trees. It was done. Darnell had been laid to rest, finally and properly. No hasty burial under fire, no unmarked grave, no forgotten promise. His name had been etched into stone, witnessed not only by a friend, but by a nation that had, even if late, chosen to look back and remember. Harold didn't expect more. He had not come to be thanked. He had not hoped for recognition. If anything, the spotlight unsettled him. All his life he had been taught that real soldiers didn't chase attention. They did their duty and faded back into the silence from which they came. And he had done just that for over 5 decades. But then came the sound of footsteps again. Soft, deliberate, not ceremonial. Harold turned his head slightly and saw General Bryant approaching alone, the gleam of his full-dress uniform muted now by the shade. The general looked older than he had hours earlier. His posture, though still upright, seemed weighted by reflection, by something unspoken. He stopped a few feet from the bench and regarded Harold with a quiet that bordered on reverence. "May I sit?" Harold gave a faint nod. The general lowered himself carefully beside him, the fabric of his uniform whispering against the bench's worn surface. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind shifted through the branches overhead. A bird called out from the distance, then fell silent again. Bryant reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with time. The edges were frayed, and a wax seal, long broken, still clung faintly to the flap. He turned it over in his hand once, then offered it to Harold. "This was found in a safe in the Pentagon," he said, "locked away with a number of classified files that were just recently declassified. It's addressed to you." Harold took it slowly. His hands, usually so steady, trembled just a little as his fingers ran across the aged paper. There was no name on the front, just a single word written in neat, careful script. Frank. His breath caught. Only one man had ever called him that in writing. Only one man had ever used that name with such effortless familiarity. He broke the seal and unfolded the page. The paper crackled. The ink, though faded, was still legible. It wasn't long, barely more than a paragraph, but it had been written with a hand that clearly knew what it meant to leave things unsaid for too long. "Frank, you never let me thank you. Not really. You saved my life and disappeared like it didn't matter. But it mattered to me. You're the only debt I carried that no medal, no command, no ceremony could repay. You let me live long enough to serve, long enough to lead, long enough to die at peace. And if there's any justice in this world, one day they'll say my name beside yours. And maybe then I'll finally feel worthy. Your friend, May." Harold stared at the words for a long time. The silence between the lines was louder than any speech. He folded the letter again, slowly and precisely, and slipped it back into its envelope. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "I know," Bryant replied. "That's why you deserve it." They sat there a while longer, not as soldier and general, but as two men who understood something about the things left behind in war, about the names never said, the friends who vanished, the years spent trying not to remember too much while carrying everything anyway. Eventually, Bryant stood. "Will you be all right?" Harold didn't answer right away. He looked out across the rows of headstones, the silent legions of the fallen. "I always was," he said. The general nodded once and walked away, leaving Harold alone again beneath the tree. Later that evening, as the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, Harold returned to the cemetery one final time. The staff had already begun packing up the temporary installations. Tents were coming down. Flags were being folded. Chairs were stacked neatly. No one noticed him as he moved quietly along the edge of the grounds, his steps slow but unwavering. He returned to the site where Darnell's ashes had been interred. The pedestal was gone now, the urn placed in the earth beneath a simple granite marker. The temporary wreath had been replaced by a bouquet of white lilies, freshly arranged. Someone had left a small plaque beneath the flowers. It read, "Darnell T. Eldridge, Sergeant, United States Army brother, warrior, friend, 1971. Home at last." Harold knelt, the stiffness in his knees sharp but ignored. He placed the envelope beside the marker and rested his palm over the cold stone. "Your name's gonna last longer than mine," he whispered, "and that's how it should be." He lingered in the hush of twilight, the cemetery bathed in the golden spill of dusk. Somewhere nearby, a bugle played taps, faint and distant but unmistakable. He closed his eyes and listened. That night, he returned to Baltimore. His house was just as he'd left it. Quiet. Still. The television remained off. The porch light clicked on as he stepped up the stairs. He stood at the door for a moment, as if unsure whether to go in, then reached into his coat pocket and drew out the velvet box with the Medal of Honor. He placed it on the mantel beneath Darnell's old photograph, then sat in his armchair and stared at it in silence. The past had never truly left him, but maybe now it had found its place. 1 year later, the sun rose over Baltimore with a softness that felt almost deliberate. It filtered gently through the tall sycamores lining the edge of a newly paved street on the east side of the city, casting golden light across a polished bronze plaque affixed to the arched entrance of a low-slung brick building. The plaque, though modest in size, bore a name that now carried the weight of generations. In raised letters, it read, "The Franklin Harold Johnson Center for Veteran Wellness." Beneath it, in smaller print, the inscription continued, "A sanctuary for those who remember." The building was simple, elegant, and purposeful. Large windows lined its front, letting in natural light. Its walls were built from warm, red brick and smooth stone, its roof slanted with gray tiles that glimmered faintly beneath the spring sky. Flags, one American, one for each military branch, and one black and white POW MIA banner, fluttered in unison beside the main walkway. A wide garden path, bordered by newly planted dogwoods and marigolds, wound through a peaceful courtyard where benches faced a serene memorial wall inscribed with names not listed in history books, but remembered by the few who carried them in silence. Crowds had gathered since early morning. Local officials, national figures, retired officers, veterans both young and old, and members of the community stood beneath a white event canopy set up across the lawn. Cameramen angled their equipment. Journalists whispered into recorders. A Marine Corps brass quartet played softly beneath the canopy's edge, their notes restrained and reverent. The ribbon cutting was set to begin at noon. There were speeches planned by a senator, the city's mayor, and a representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs. General Alexander Bryant, now freshly retired and bearing the distinction of the nation's highest peacetime honor, stood near the entrance with hands folded behind his back, surveying the crowd with quiet pride. Near him, Colonel Frank Mendez spoke with a small cluster of former Ghost Company members, their laughter, low and rare, held like something precious. And yet, despite the applause, the ribbon, the flags, and the cameras, one man was conspicuously absent from the platform. Harold Johnson stood on the far side of the courtyard, beyond the crowd and the spotlight, beneath the quiet canopy of a wide-armed tree. He wore a simple, dark overcoat, the collar upturned slightly against the wind. His hands were folded behind his back, and in one of them he held a single white lily. Its petals, slightly curled at the edges, fluttered in the breeze as he looked toward the center's front doors. He had not approached the ribbon. He had not taken a seat among the honored guests. He had not asked for a speech, nor prepared any remarks. It was not that he was shy, nor did he carry resentment. He simply believed that the building, like the mission it now represented, spoke more clearly without him at the microphone. From his vantage point, he watched everything unfold, the press adjusting their angles, veterans in wheelchairs flanked by family members, a group of young Navy recruits standing at attention near the front. It was all well organized, thoughtful, even beautiful. He appreciated it, but he didn't need it. When the mayor took the stage, she spoke warmly of sacrifice and legacy. The senator followed, recounting the moment he'd first heard Harold's story from Bryant's own lips and how it had moved him to push legislation for historical recognition of undocumented wartime units. The VA representative delivered statistics and promises, while the crowd politely applauded. Finally, General Bryant stepped up to the podium. His voice, calm and measured, carried without strain. "There are stories we tell to remember history," he began. "And then there are stories we live quietly, so others might have history to remember." He paused, his gaze searching the crowd, then finding Harold beneath the tree. Their eyes met, and the general gave a slight nod before continuing. "This center is not just a tribute to Sergeant Franklin Harold Johnson. It's a commitment. To every veteran who returned home and didn't find the help they needed. To those who carried wounds unseen. To those who remembered what others forgot. This is their space now." The crowd turned toward the building as the ceremonial ribbon, an understated length of navy blue silk, was cut cleanly across by a decorated Marine with silver shears. Applause followed, quiet and sincere. The first guests were guided forward, stepping through the newly opened doors. Inside, light flooded the lobby. On the right stood the reception desk, staffed by veteran volunteers. On the left stretched a row of photographs, curated from anonymous wartime archives, with captions that simply read, "Still Here." Farther inside, the center opened into rooms filled with warmth and utility. Counseling offices, group therapy halls, physical rehabilitation wings, and community kitchens. There was a woodworking shop, a library, and a meditation room. Beyond them, the far wing led to a quiet garden courtyard lined with marble benches and a koi pond. Near its center, a modest sculpture stood, a soldier's boots, a helmet on the ground beside them, and a folded flag atop a stone platform. At the base, the same words etched onto the outer wall appeared again, "For those who remember." But Harold did not enter. He remained beneath the tree, watching as, one by one, the veterans began to file into the center. Some young, some ancient, some with prosthetics, others with trembling hands or walking sticks. A few paused near him, recognizing him immediately. They offered nods. One or two murmured a respectful "Sergeant." He nodded back, never shifting from his place. Bryant found him there at last, approaching slowly with his hands clasped behind him. "You won't even walk through it?" Harold looked toward the door again. "I don't need to," he said. The general waited. "I saw them go in," Harold continued. "That's enough." Bryant considered him a moment, then chuckled under his breath. "You always were a stubborn old bastard." Harold smirked slightly. "Takes one to know one." They stood there together for a while, side by side, watching as the ribbon flapped gently in the breeze now that it had fallen in two. "I told you I didn't want a building," Harold said. Bryant looked out across the courtyard. "It's not a building." Harold arched a brow. "It's a thank you," the general said, "etched in stone, for every man who gave more than he got." For a moment, Harold said nothing. Then he looked down at the lily in his hand. "You think they'll come?" Bryant followed his gaze toward the center's open doors, where two young women in army fatigues were helping an older man with a cane up the ramp. Behind them, a father with a child in his arms and a prosthetic where his leg should have been stepped forward through the glass. "They already have," the general said. Harold looked once more, then turned away. He didn't need to stay. He had seen what mattered. The center would continue, with or without him. The names would be read, the doors would remain open, and the silence would finally have a place to speak. As he walked slowly down the side path, his shoes crunching softly against the gravel, people turned to watch. They didn't shout, they didn't cheer, but they noticed. He no longer passed invisible through crowds. Heads nodded, hands rose in subtle salutes. Some simply stepped aside, offering space without needing to be asked. Harold didn't acknowledge them directly. He wasn't one for spectacle. But deep down, something shifted again. Not pride, not satisfaction, peace. And it stayed with him as he disappeared around the edge of the courtyard, the lily still held gently in his hand. In the distance, a child's laughter echoed from inside the center, and beneath the soft hush of the trees, the world remembered. Subscribe for more stories like this. Watch the next video to keep going, and share this one with someone who needs to see it.